is on games as cultural touchstones. I'm going to let the panel introduce themselves here first, and then I'm going to run through a couple slides, and then we're going to have some questions. We're going to answer your questions. We'll focus on your questions unless someone raises their hand. And then at the end, there's the interpretive dance segment, which I think you'll love.
Hey everybody, my name is James Portnow. Most of you have heard this spiel before. I'm a game designer by trade. I've worked on games from Farmville to Stuff by Square Enix to Call of Duty to League of Legends to whatever. I teach, and I'm better known for writing a show called Extra Credits.
Luke Peterson, I work on mostly tabletop games, as game designer for Bakugan, which I'm probably best known for. Teach critical game analysis, which is sort of how to do a game. And I make some games on Facebook with friends, or on Kickstarter with some friends, with a company called Fun Dilemma. This is my third panel in a row, so I'm a little tired.
Hi, I'm Dan Gronsky, and I'm trying to break everything up here. I'm a PhD. I concentrate on media studies. I mostly do film studies, but I do game studies as well. And I've been doing stuff here at Magus for the last, like 4 years now. So hopefully you can see me around.
Hi everybody, I'm Sujan Shrestha. I'm a faculty at the University of Baltimore at the game design program. I teach game design, but primarily this panel was interesting because I'm just doing my research a little bit on the evolution theory and game development, so we'll talk about that a little bit.
All right, so what is this panel about? Well, we all know that there are slides that don't advance, let me tell you. There are lots of things that get studied in high school and colleges. Sort of a liberal arts education, you have film studies, you have art studies. My school had a class on 20th century sitcoms, I think. And the question of this panel is, do games belong on this list? The reason those other things are studied is pretty clear. They either reflect the culture, or they move it forward, or they have something to offer us about the times they were in. So, why are they studied? They can't be avoided. Every movement has a soundtrack. Every historical period leaves a record of something that they have, and our games are a record. And it's not like they haven't been around for a while. Right? They've been around for a long time, and you still probably can't take the class on the social impact of games. Which leads to the question, is the fact that they are seen as only a distraction the reason they will be studied? Games as a whole, what we did, we couldn't do something? Or will they be studied for some greater reason because they taught us something about ourselves and the folks around us? Do 3 quick slides on a comparison. This person will be studied. Right? This culture. She's done some amazing things. I'm actually a big fan. Her last album deal was considered revolutionary. She pre-sold the streaming rights for her last album to Apple for $12 million. And that sum of money was amazing. The digital revolution sort of destroyed the music industry, and she found a way around it. But then there's this. This isn't a far along example. It's a few months ago, right? Destiny. Do I just mean nothing? Am I just a distraction? Maybe. And this one, which apparently has, this is taken from another presentation I've done, so we're just going to do it. Yeah? Okay. There we go. So, Harry Potter, biggest movie launch of all time, the biggest series of books of all time, I believe, did $483 million. This essentially know-nothing game, not a sequel, no star power, crushed it. And that's just on launch, right? So, do games deserve some respect? Now I'm done. I'll just pose this first question to the panel, I'll answer. Are games having a meaningful effect on how we interact with each other and how we judge ourselves?
That is a really, really interesting question that is really hard to answer. I'll concentrate really on the second part there, how we judge ourselves. And the more I think about it, the more I think the answer is yes, especially when we are not good at them. How many people in here have felt bad about ourselves when we weren't good at a game? And I think if you start counting not just video games, if you start counting, sports, which are definitely games, that is like literally everyone in the world.
And I mean, I was actually going to do the exact same thing, right? How many of you guys feel like you've had a meaningful experience that has made you understand something about yourself within a video game? Right, that's most of us. I think this is actually fairly straightforward.
Yeah. I will say it has socially changed the way we interact with each other. If you watch high school kids today on a date or a multiple date, you will often see them playing console games. That's a meaningful interaction at a time when we are forming that is now being huddled around the campfire of a console, which is new. All right. For the end here. Does a game need to be popular to matter?
Most art that has mattered has not been popular in its time.
I don't know if you can say most, but there's definitely a significant volume of work that was not popular when it came out. And that's sort of a weird thing. I've talked about this in the context of film studies a lot, actually, because film studies really does concentrate on the artsy kind of films, the things, the prestigious pictures. And when you look at something like James Cameron's Avatar, which, let me tell you right now, I've never been more wrong about anything than I was about Avatar, because I was like, this thing is going to tank, this is a disaster. And it is the highest grossing worldwide motion picture of all time. I was way off base on that. And I think, like, if you're going to study film and what film means to human society, you have to look at the films that people watched. People didn't just watch Avatar, they watched Avatar. And just because I personally didn't see the appeal doesn't give me the right to say, I live in an ivory tower and this film is bullshit and we're going to talk about something else. Which happens.
Well, and I do think it is a valid question of, will Avatar matter in 150 years? And we look at a lot of great literature, great philosophy, a lot of this stuff, I mean, even great art, right? Great paintings. A lot of these things were not as popular as the pop culture of their day. And I think pop culture is incredibly important, incredibly worth being studied, but I think that it shows us how little popular reception to overall impact on humanity correlate.
Can I respond back to that? Sure. Yeah, just to respond back to that very quickly. I mean, again, coming from film, there's a lot of stuff back at the beginning, like D.W. Griffith, who like invented a lot of what we consider the modern language of filmmaking, how you cut, how you edit, stuff like that. Was tremendously popular in his day, and if you ask the average Joe on the street who was D.W. Griffith, they don't know. So, I mean, important in 100 years is like a contextual question. Important how, important to who.
So, I would rather go in a little bit in a different alignment rather than a game need to be popular for what is a popular game does to us. I mean, the term of popular game is very different than does the game needs to be popular. And I was in diversity panel before, right before this. I don't know how many people were there, but it brings up a interesting question on what happens with the popular games and how does it change the socioeconomic, race, gender, age, and all different varieties of things, and how does that changes to our society, not only just in America, but also outside. Who we play with, how we play with, how do we represent to ourselves. Are you associating yourself to a certain group of people, or are you associating with certain countries, certain look? And it does matter. It does make a difference on how we see ourselves, how we see other people. Film studies showed in the previous, I was making a comment earlier, at time, the look matter. If you were a Russian look, then you're in a film. You're always a villain in a film at one point. Now if you go to the games, there are a lot of Middle Eastern in the games that always get killed. But what about that perception change? What if you're playing a game as a Middle Eastern? What happens then? How does that affect that particular socioeconomic? I mean, I argue about the Call of Duty and other games, and the other phenomena is also the idea of acceptance. How are we accepting these games? What's happening when we accept these games from the cognition perspective? In terms of why are we accepting, it's a very interesting question. It's like your parents telling us. Our parents telling us don't do drugs, but we did it anyway, right? Don't smoke pot, we smoked it anyway. Don't eat French fries from McDonald's because it can kill you, but I'll go and eat it anyway. guess what? Don't smoke cigarette. It will kill you eventually. But I'll smoke it anyway. So why do we do it? And that's the part that we would probably argue a little bit.
No.
And just one thing, by the way, the reason I was giving you some perspective is as a consulting designer, I work with a lot of AAA companies, and all that matters. All I hear all the time is what matters is $20 a room and how many people pay it. And so I just need to be able to put that it does matter, right? It is important. Pop culture is important, but it is not the only important thing.
So, and the last panel, I put up something that your question to answer. The panel I was in earlier was, is it okay to like terrible things? Which I loved. That was a great panel. And that's sort of like the panel of is it okay to like something that other people think is offensive. Then we went on to diversity. Let's try not to be offensive. And now we're in, what are people going to look back at? Are they going to look back at us being offensive? Are they going to look back at the first game that brings people together in a meaningful way? What does it mean to make a game where you make your enemies of a place and time? They're Russians. Versus if you make a game like Minecraft, where you still have the race of Steve, but that game is infinitely playable across the world at a very low price. Now a kid from a much poorer neighborhood can interact with a kid from a much richer neighborhood on exactly even footing.
Yeah, not always exactly.
Well, not always exactly, but close. I worked in this game Bakugan, and I worked with Pokemon, the trading card game when it first came out, and I saw kids who would interact with each other in a way they would never do it. They're at an airport, they're waiting for a plane. You have Bakugan, I have Bakugan, let's talk about our Bakugan. That's why I love cosplay, right? It's like the instant in. Oh, you like that too? Oh, you've got pine cones. Let's talk pine cones, right? It's awesome. All right, so I don't know if you've done that. Well, maybe study for their social impact. How else are games affecting the way we interact with each other?
I don't have to use it. This way I can object to just whatever you say.
Okay, that is a tricky question for me personally. For me personally.
No, it's not.
Because this is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, the way I study things typically. But you're absolutely right about the fact that it's going to be those ones that have that big multicultural, multimedia component to them. I think it's actually going to wind up being stuff like Candy Crush, mobile gaming.
So I think a social reflection is going to be very interesting, right? Because we look back today and we see old movies with white men in blackface, or with Indians rather than Native Americans who are just there to be shot, and we feel shame, right? We feel embarrassed about seeing some of this film. And like 50 years from now, 100 years from now, we may look back at some of our FPSs that we're just churning out today and feel exactly the same way. So I think that reflection, we need to think about how it reflects on us. But I think it also has a lot of social impact, like we're saying, people playing together. Many of you heard my story last time about people learning about other cultures by playing games online, and all of a sudden that culture becomes real to them, right? These aren't just abstract people you hear about on the news, but real human beings who like the same thing you do. So I think that's just a huge part of bringing us together in a way that no other media can.
I agree with you.
I feel like we're at a point in time that will at least be studied, I would say for sure. I believe that there was always a stigma to being geek, and now we're the records that we've won, right? Everything that we think is cool, the rest of the world now thinks is cool. When the Green Bay Packers come out as Settlers Catan players, and you know, everyone's parents have a game on their phone where they're playing Candy Crush. We've reached a point where it is going to change the way we interact with each other. It's given us one more human thing in contact, and that can be good and bad. In the 1950s, more divorces were caused by bullying than anything else. Because for the first time in history, people got together based on what they liked to do, not who they happened to live next to. So there's a lot of interesting social things that can happen with games that can change just because of the way we play and the way we talk to each other.
So I'm just going to give you one example, not to offend anybody, but just my own experience of being an American. So if I'm walking the street in downtown Baltimore, somebody will say, "Come hi" to me, and the next question usually would be, "Where are you from?" I always wonder why that question's always been asked to me, even if I'm an American. And then once I start speaking, usually people would say, "Well, you are American," but I tell them I'm not American. Why is that even relevant. Why do I have to explain to people whether I'm American or not American based on my look and the way I speak? I didn't start speaking until 15 years ago, basically. So this is, just because I lost an accent doesn't mean I lost my identity for who I am. And sometimes games can do that for you. I think it's a media representation is sometimes hugely in our cognition, sometimes dependence. It is a dependence. And sometimes it changes social parameters of how we live and how we interact with other people in a social scope.
All right, so this next question is, sort of goes to that Lady Gaga thing. Even our AAA titles, we don't have a creator culture of star power. Now, when you get really in the weeds with you, we do, right? But we don't have a Mozart. You know, someone says, who made Call of Duty? Who made, well, except for Minecraft, that's the one really bizarre exception to this rule. You can nail that on one guy almost exclusively. So are we going to have that breakout person that changes something, or view that, other than Sid Meier's tool, as the guy or the lady who does it? Or are we going to be reliant on the character themselves, like a character that makes us look at people differently and change things around? Or do we have examples of that already?
I don't wait for him to talk about it.
Well, this is an interesting one because it's got a direct parallel to film studies, the cult of star power, a personality of fame, and it would be, I'll just say it would be stupid to say that games will never have somebody like that. It's just how, as a society, especially in America, how we do things. We will find somebody and make them a star. On the other hand, I really think that a lot of times, like, it's not that stars have no value, they definitely have value. They bring interest, they bring money and revenue to projects that they're on. I think a lot of times star power gets overestimated, the importance of star power gets overestimated. And I think the games industry so far is a bit of a testament to that. That you do have certain star creators, you have guys that people buy their games, people buy, I buy Miyamoto games. If his name's on the game, I buy the game. But we have a lot of games that, you know, Call of Duty. Who makes Call of Duty? Who gives a shit? It's Call of Duty. And that's the star. The star is Call of Duty. So it's an interesting parallel, but also an interesting split, I think. And I'm going to say it matters, but possibly not as much as we might immediately think that it would.
So, I think that we in some ways have something even cooler than star power. I think, yes, it's important. Stars are clearly a cultural touchstone, but they are a cultural touchstone for themselves and not necessarily the media that they're in, right? We talk about Tom Hanks' life or whatever, right? And not necessarily him as representing the films that he's been in, or the characters he's played. But in games, we do have stars. We have star characters. We've seen, I mean, walking through these halls, you can see people adopting the roles of those characters, becoming those characters as they become in games. Mario is as well known as Mickey Mouse, right? There have been studies that have shown this. So we have these stars, but they aren't other people. They're not people we can't be, right? You look at your Lady Gaga or whoever, and most people say, well, that can't be me, right? You look at Toby Bryant or whatever, and you just go, that's somebody else. He's awesome, but he's not me.
That's a really, I keep getting this too close to my mouth, I'm sorry. It's a really excellent observation because, like, there's so much aspiration to movie stars. I want to be like Tom Hanks. I want to have his life. I want to be famous and respected like Tom Hanks. I want to be handsome like Tom Hanks. I want to be Mario. Give me 2 minutes. I will be Mario. In fact, Mario's nobody without me.
I think that we will have star power in this industry, and I think it'll be subversive. I think the guy who made Angry Birds, star power. And because he did it the way he did it from where he did it, I think the first game you play that's amazing, and you find out that the person who made it looks nothing like you, and comes from a culture nothing like yours, but you love their game, I think that'll take him from the behind the curtain and turn her into the most amazing thing you've ever seen. It's an amazing opportunity because there is a break between the designer or designers, the artists, and the player. We don't get to see them. But I think when that curtain comes up, we're going to be stunned at who's making games that entertain us in 20 years. It's going to be awesome.
And that's sort of an interesting thing too. It's sort of about other people. And as somebody who's had the opportunity to actually travel to other places around the world and meet people from places that are not the place I grew up, what you start to learn is that people are kind of people wherever you go. Obviously there are cultural differences, but you have a lot more in common with somebody on the other side of the planet than you might think that you do, just because you've never met them before. The technology of games lets us meet these people from the other side of the world and lets us see they are people just like us.
I'll just make a small comment on it. I'm not going to get into the fight with these guys on those, but I'm looking from the world perspective a little bit on the star power. It's all about perspective, right? So if you go to Eastern Europe, places like Berlin, Germany, a board game has a more star power than a video game that we actually play in America. And so if you go to going to parks in China, you go there. There are board games that has more popular version of it than actually a video game. Well, two reasons: one, accessibility, resources, and various other factors. But the fact that these games has more star powers than the electronic video game has to do something with it. The way it shapes the culture, the way they think, the way they cook, the way they live, the way they dress, the way they look. All different kind of things that has been come out of these. So that's just my short note. I didn't know you were.
No, I love tabletop. So I mentioned I come from a tabletop background, and I'm going to answer my own question because I love this question. So tabletop games, they're the step shop, right? We don't make nearly as much money. Every time I walk into a place and people ask me what I do, and I say I make games, they go, "Oh, you make computer games?" I just give up and I say yes. I essentially pray to be here. It's easier for me. But interestingly, tabletop games are unique in this that I have to sit across the table from you and look at you in the face. And there's lots of developmental work on picking up micro-expressions, how you can tell intuitively if someone can lie. And that's a lot easier to pick up when you look at people. There are people who believe, I do not believe this is true, that if you spend your time gaming like this, instead of like this, that you will start to lose that ability. And if that happens, that will definitely be studied. But I believe tabletop games will be more popular because they tend to last longer. Call of Duty 3 comes out, Call of Duty 4 comes out, Call of Duty 3 goes away. Settlers of Catan, being played for 20 years, will be played essentially forever. It could become the monopoly that people talk about.
Well, and I was just going to say, many of you just saw we just did an episode on Chutes and Ladders and all the amazing meaning that actually is deep within that game. But there's more literature written on both philosophy and strategy of Go than any computer game or video game that's ever been made.
Well, computer game ever? We ever have a computer game that hangs out forever?
So this is the question. When I talk to other video game designers, one of the big goals, the goal we all have about is making the next soccer, right? Not making the next Call of Duty. That's not the real goal. The goal is, how do we do this thing that's going to last forever? There's a lot of debate. We could have a whole panel on esports and people trying to establish that a game which is a perpetual game.
I have a question for you on that front, which is going back to something you mentioned before, which is that money is very, very important. Do companies have a vested interest in not making a permanent game?
So they did until we found out ways to monetize, repeat monetize, right? When you bought something at $6 in a box, absolutely, we had to turn out something every year, right? That's why Madden came out every single year. But now, if we just sell it to you a roster update digitally, well, maybe we can keep the core of Madden the same and keep players playing with the same rule set, except where the NFL or whatever switches rules. But now that we've found other ways to monetize it, it's become possible.
I keep bringing up Minecraft because it's such a big deal. Minecraft could be that game. The problem with oh yes. Okay.
So you brought up Go, and I've played Go before. I like it. It's 3,000 years old. But what would you have said if Go was, say, as old as Minecraft? What if you compared them then? Would there still be philosophy books written on Go, or would there, if Minecraft was 4,000 years old, would there be philosophy books written on Minecraft?
There is a shocking number of books written on Minecraft, actually. Yeah. Super happy. So I spent the last 7 months doing consulting in Europe. I haven't been home. This is the first time I've been in the United States in 7 months. And everywhere I went, no matter what country, no matter what language, I would go to bookstores. And they would have tons of books. At this point, mostly aimed at younger children. But some of them not actually books on how to play the game, but books about like things you could learn from playing Minecraft, or stories about or in the world of Minecraft. And so, I think it is it's far too early to say about probably 2,900 some odd years. But I think maybe. I think it's possible. I just think that we can't. The only reason I brought up Go like that is because the question was, could board games possibly be that relevant? Yes. That doesn't mean that video games can't be either, right? And I think it's definitely possible.
I think if we get a digital game that becomes Go, it'll be essentially free at some point. The profit motive does, when you say Go, I'm like, oh, he plays the new Go expansion. And because I didn't have to say that and you still want to play the game, it makes sense to me. It is very easy to copy a game that's stagnant. So the desire to make Madden next year is to add a little bit more, make it a little harder to catch us, a little bit different, a little bit interesting. You don't do that to Go. So I think a digital game will have to be something that somebody makes and then says, world, it's yours. It's past making money for me.
And I think a lot of those games like that, something they have in common is that they actually have incredibly simple rule sets that become incredibly complex as they spread out. And that sort of simplification of the concept, I think, is sort of the key to it. So it sort of negates the idea of expansions and DLC and stuff like that.
Everybody familiar with the term network externality? Doesn't matter. All that means is the value of a game that you play is not based on how much it costs. It's based on how much other people, how many people you know or might interact with also played. So Magic the Gathering could be a game that matters in this way because although they do expansions, the network of Magic the Gathering players is so big that a new game can't come along and copy it because it's using all of the existing Magic the Gathering players. I can sell you a game way better than Magic, designed by the same guy who will tell you it's way better than Magic. And Magic's still a better experience because that's what everyone else who plays card games is playing.
I'm going to wait until Luke goes to the next slide.
Okay, so Ivory Tower. I describe the Ivory Tower as, people on this panel.
People on this panel, I like that.
Yeah.
People on this panel.
Yeah. But we spend some of our time with clients doing consulting about real-world issues, and then we spend some of our time thinking about the future, like this panel, and larger issues.
And the rest of it thinking about this client.
Yes. Only with other NDA-protected people. Yeah.
So complaining about the people who pay your bills is kind of a national pastime, and you get right down to it.
Yeah. So we play these Ivory Tower games designed that are to teach you about a simple concept. We heard about some in the last panel. What was the one game where you had to work as a team to get something done? Every time you gave someone a direction, they all turned wacky ways. Or a game that sort of really pushes in your face how you judge things by color first and not by behavior.
White.
Yeah. So, do these games matter in long term?
Have you all heard of Train? Some of you guys, I've seen some no's. Okay, so Train, Brenda Bratmike made a game, Brenda Romero now. She made a game that was fairly simple. And there's only one copy of this game in existence, where it's a very Ivory Tower game. So you can only play it at a very few art installations or gatherings. But it was this game where it was about, you had this little train, and you had all these little figures, and you moved from stop to stop, and it has some pretty simple rules about trying to get the most of these little figures on this train before it got to the end of the track. And at each station, you flipped over the name of the station, and you kept going and going. And the last station is Auschwitz. And by this point, you've stacked in your little people upside down and sideways, and you cram them in however you can. And you did it all just because the rules told you that's what you were supposed to do. You didn't ask what the end was, you didn't ask the end goal, you didn't think about any of these things. And this is a game I encourage you all to look up, right? But, I mean, even by me saying it here, and then you going out and telling your friends, this game will have an effect. And I've seen many of the independent game designers who are trying new things always go back and reference this game, even though there's only one copy of existence. So I do think that these games have an impact.
I think they absolutely have an impact, especially in terms of play mechanics. Because it's the people that are thinking about play mechanics that are going to figure out how do we improve them, how do we come up with new ones, how do we build on what we've already got. And even if that game itself doesn't necessarily make a big splash among regular people, that's going to reach the other people that make games. They're going to make the big, AAA titles that do reach millions of people, and those mechanics are going to spread out from there.
I think it's just not the it's not just these small games, indie games, but I want to kind of get into a little bit of Title I games that actually do teach us some of these contexts as well. I mean, you have to think about consciously about it. I mean, I wouldn't, until I played Call of Duty, I just did not understand how the racial division between in the games happen, right? So there are other games too, of course. But even in Title I games, I mean, and James can probably tag along on this one, there are places in context to where it does matter for what we learn and how it actually impacts us directly over and over again. It's a matter of thinking. It's a matter of how we see these things in a clear sense or not. Or we're just playing game just to replay value, or just playing game because I can't finish that level and I want to finish that level just because I'm a gamer. So the player perspective is a critical piece of this context. It's a huge piece.
So James here did a bit on narrative in games and why it's challenging that we tend to remember the things we do in games, not the actual stories there. I just want to get to talk to that because obviously the stories are infinitely studyable and can be incredibly powerful when you look at history. Some books have been written that have just changed the world, right? So can a game get there, and what are the big challenges? I'm just going to hand the mic to Ken.
So I think there's a lot of different answers to this. In one sense, it's the fault of us as an industry because we sort of train the player to not play for anything but the most superficial play, right? And not for the rest of the context, to not spend more time thinking about it. I know that sounds weird, but we've been hiding behind this idea that we're just making a pastime, that we're just making games for a very long time, and I think that has affected how we market to our audience and how we address our audience. You hear all the time, you get blowback whenever you say, hey, there's more to this game. You'll get people, especially on the internet, pushing back, saying, oh, don't add all this meaning to my game, right? We've trained that into this audience, so we have to get past that. Also, I think that stories are hugely important, and there's a lot. I mean, people will talk about Bioshock story all the time, but very often we talk about specific moments. But also within this context, because you live them, choices and characters are as important as story, and I think that those have huge meaning, right? The characters we associate with tell us something about ourselves. The choices we make within these games tell us something about ourselves. And so, as much as narrative, I think there's this new form of, I don't know exactly what I would call it. I mean, it's sort of narrative, but of associative experience that we get in games that we don't necessarily get in other media.
There's a gentleman in the back there who's been patiently waiting.
The prior forms of art to games have all been a distillation of experience either in a single painting or a story as told, whereas games, you're no longer experiencing someone else's perception of whatever experience or story they're trying to tell you. You are participating in it. And so if you start telling story via gameplay, like with Paper Please or that train game you were talking about, there's not narrative there, but there's story that you're.
And your story will be different from anyone else's who plays it.
But not necessarily. Like the trains game, if you just do it and whether you packed it completely full or not, it's still a sort of a, oh shit, when you get to that last station. But and like with Papers, Please, you're, in the 1984 setting, and it's more, it can be a shared experience across, much like the stories as told in book or art or paintings, but it's a more personal shared experience.
Game designers, I say it all the time, we don't get to make an experience. We make a fun room. We make a room, and we hope that your time in that room is fun. And if we make it the right way, it'll more or less be fun most of the time. But everything you take, everything you brought in is with you, and every decision you make is yours, hopefully. But as a narrative, we have a lot of control over narrative as game design. Even just the setting we pick. And I think as the tools become more and more available, we're going to see some stories told in settings that just make us cry. Right?
That's a big part of any kind of storytelling too, especially like in film. People talk about like, the objectivity of a documentary, but there's no such thing. Where you put the camera, who you choose to talk to, where you edit the clip at, everything becomes part of that narrative storytelling. And I did do a panel on video game narratives here last year, and one of the things we talked about is that big dichotomy between the story that you're trying to tell and the story that the player is developing on their own. Because, I mean, unless you're playing a visual novel, at which point it's right there in the genre description, it's a novel, you're reading a story. The things you do will always have some sort of an impact on your play experience, even if the narrative itself is completely scripted.
And I mean, I think you raised an important distinction, right? In every other media, whether it be a painting or a film or a book, you're interpreting someone else's perspective, right? You're getting the ideas of an author or a director. Whereas in games, you really are, we define the boundaries of the experience, but you are defining the experience for yourself. And so even in something like Train, which is completely linear in some ways, the reason you have that horrific moment at the end is because you realize, why didn't I ask why, right? Throughout the entire time, you're being told to stack all this on your back. And I just followed these rules. I never asked why. It's because you had that agency, you had that opportunity to change the experience, to walk away, and you didn't take it, right? That's the thing that Spec Ops is challenging for all the time. And so, in all of these things, we also have this unique relationship in games that we don't have in other things where we're not just receiving someone else's perspective, but also imparting our own.
Oh, yes, absolutely. All right, go.
When we talk about the different stories, like, I understand that stories would be so unique. I went to college, I was in the English department. What do you think it would take, or what would be your argument to studying these stories with the impact they are? To studying this, like, how did I think it's in common books and film, but what would be your argument if those stories are just important?
Well, the problem I've always had doing video game studies in an academic environment isn't that it's not hard to make the argument that they're just as important. It's actually a very easy argument to make. The problem is that the medium itself, it's a long-form medium that requires sort of a base level of competency at fulfilling the objectives, whatever they might be. I mean, that's sort of one of the weird things is you go to school for, like 12 years prior to that point, and I'm pretty sure that you can read. You can read American English because you've taken many classes on it and people have yelled at you if you failed to do it correctly. I don't know that you can complete Super Mario Brothers because no one has ever made you do that. And that becomes sort of like, there are a bunch of little variables like that you start to think about, how would I put this class together? Because I feel like I could very easily pitch it to a curriculum committee and get that put on the curriculum of my college. Like, we're going to study video games. It's going to be an art elective and a humanities elective. There's a lot to learn from that. There's a lot of academic value to it. But how do you do it? Like how do you set the class up? A theory, a story, a narrative class like that. Design is, I don't want to say easy is the wrong word, but like there is a way to do that academically in 15 weeks. To do, if I wanted to study Okami in 15 weeks, I don't know that I could do it.
If you don't sleep, you could.
Yes, if it is literally 15 full weeks.
How much does it feel that you wanted to start taking questions? Or?
Yeah, I would answer that question though too. I don't think necessarily we've seen the best story from games yet. I don't think we've seen the story that changes the world. I do think we've seen games change society by how we interact with each other. And I think that is already worth studying. I'm waiting for the great story that makes us all go, oh my gosh, we need to totally not do something. And there's some ivory tower games that are trying, but no more oil. We're not using oil anymore. I played this game and oil is so bad I'm not using oil. That's what I understand.
So I actually think we also have to think about how we study these differently, whether it be in smaller sections or, for example, I was just in Norway and there was a guy who was teaching ethics through The Walking Dead. But I think that in doing so, they did a better analysis of The Walking Dead than I had ever seen before. Rather than taking our standard literary analytics tools, we have to think about new ways of exploring these. We have the medium as games are by a huge margin, and yet before we could academically study those, there was a bunch of things that we had to understand about the medium of comics. And I don't think we've established those for games yet.
Yes. All right. About the question if a game can change the world or change how people view the world, like a single game having that kind of critical impact. And I think it kind of asks that question, kind of begs the question: is it possible for anything to change the world? Movies, music, or literature change the world like that anymore? We live in such a connected world where there's so much potential, there's so many movies being made, where it's not like back in the days 100 years ago, where you could where just the fact that you could publish, it was a very small market out there, very small amount of competition, so it was very easy to stand out. Whereas now there's so much, it's even possible for you to stand above the crowd in any medium, not just games, and then should be holding video games to that standard.
So the term for that situation is postmodern, right? Is it so easy to make stuff that nothing has a chance to rise? Because once it starts to rise, everyone copies it and it brings it back down to the bottom. I still think it's possible. And I think with social media it's even more possible, and I think the world perspective is that's when you can really make a difference. When you make a game that makes people want to interact with people from a different area of the world in a different way, I think you could catch on fire like Settlers of Catan has.
I would even say that, I mean, I've argued this in videos before, but I think the world would be a fundamentally different place because this generation was brought up on Minecraft rather than being brought up on FPS. I think that actually would fundamentally affect the generation.
Also want to point out, just trying to catch up on a couple of questions that we had earlier too. How many people have seen the movie called Rashomon? Okay, so if you haven't seen it, I think you should see it. I think games.
Everyone should see it.
There are other movies too, but I just came up to my brain. But the idea of Rashomon effect is actually what we see in games. So is that going to be a better game? We're going to change the world? I think, my opinion, I don't know. I think it's a very interesting question. I always tell my son, don't be violent. The first thing as a boy he does is something kicking or something violent. So I can't really tell when he gets older if he's not going to be violent at all. So the idea is, where does he take that violence into that level? Whether it's going to perpetuate something different or something he starts to calm down and start to see humanity as a humans. So that is the bigger, larger question I think we're trying to.
All the game has to do to change the world is change one person who becomes a leader. That's it.
And I would say actually even thinking about the story or the game that will change the world is even the wrong way to look at it, because I think it's going to be the stories that change the world. It's going to be the games that change the world and how they work together. And maybe there won't be that one game that says we're not using oil anymore, or democracy is a fool's errand. We need kings again. Maybe it will be 6 or 10 games in a row that come together that form this canon, and that's going to be the change.
Yes.
How would you contextualize establishing in games, being that we're so young, in that if you're taking we go from Tom to Super Mario to even say Sonic, and then just going up through the timeline, how do you establish an actual canon to be studied in a way that establishes just people that this is where we come from, this is how important this is the roots of video games.
Oh, this one's an easy one. The same way we've done everything else. 5 people will pick a canon, and then 25 people will tell them they're assholes and wrong. And that will continue for about 150 years.
It's way in the back.
Yes, this game, you talked about these cultural milestones. Do you think in the next, say, couple more years, you said people will look back negatively at the FPSs of how we look at nuisance and such. Do you think that is actually the reverse might be true, or something like saying we should do more, or something like that? Because with reactions of what's going on today, it just seems like, people will use like, tragedies, like say what's happened like in France, or say, see, all people in Middle East are like this. And there might be more people looking at, Muslims or people who are in Islam and the same, as a negative light. So
I'll make sure I summarize your question correctly. It was, do you think in the future that games could be having a negative impact, or where Minecraft per se, I guess, is a positive, or maybe there's a negative where they see things on the screen and they start acting out in that way?
yeah, that's negative as the world around it sees it negative, and
even though us in this room might think it's fine.
but yeah, everything else, that sort of.
Well, if you watch the 700 Club, you would know that PG is going to make us all Satan worshiping child killers. And that was actually.
And that's a problem you run into with just about anything, actually, is the echo chamber. And I love you guys, you're all great guys, but here's the thing, we get in a room, we start talking to each other, we're all going to wind up with the same opinion at the end of the day. And then are we right? How do we know? Because we just keep reinforcing each other. And that happens everywhere, and that happens with bad opinions, that happens with good opinions. And it's a dangerous thing to watch out for, but it's very, very hard to see it when it's happening to you.
Yes.
First of all, like not something you were saying about the Tuesday, and like I said, we're already at a number of beautiful books, and I like to recommend you. And anyone else who really saying like this stuff in this book called The Ultimate History of Video Games. It's like this textbook-sized book, and it talks like a lot of the games. Particularly like the period that I find it's simply a lot, because like the time between like when video games were invented and when they failed, like that entire like period is split. And there's a lot that can be worked in that period, and that's what I'm talking about a lot of stuff. I recommend it. But my question was, or I guess my point I want to make there is that going back to this sort of thing about like how we're actually reading games, I think the thought is that I think a lot of we kind of use the comics. I think we're still reading games a lot in the same way that we want to read like books or movies. Like we keep saying, like, looking forward to the story. I mean, going back to Train, I mean, like, it's really easy to look at Train and say the message of Train is that the Holocaust is bad. But obviously, that goes without saying, and like that comes across sometimes for beyond the opposite stuff. But what makes like Train such an experience is that like, the interactivity means that there are a number of sort of ways that can bring up to each person that informs what Train is. Because you can't just automatically assume that like the end point of the game is that first grade say the game and then everybody realizes what he did is bad. Because like, I've heard when people play it and they play it and they'll keep playing and someone will be like, why are you doing it? And it's like, well, my guy's a conductor and he has to play it to you. The game and they can't immediately get what it is. And I'm not playing it. And that in and of itself is still playing the game. The thing is, that's not looking at the narrative or the story that the game is twisting and telling. It's looking at what the mechanics say about the game. And I think that's the kind of narrative you're looking at. Not sort of like this, it's the end and narrative story, but rather the narrative that like the players get from the people actually playing and interacting with the game. That's what makes like games such an awesome and unique experience. I think that's what makes them art and what we need to be looking at when we say game art,
That's a great point, and it's something actually that came up in the problematic games panel earlier today. What's your takeaway? Where does it come from? The death of the author thing. The intention is to teach you that the Holocaust is bad. That doesn't mean your takeaway is not going to be, must have been really hard to be a good Nazi filling these trains. I mean, this is really difficult work. And wow, getting the trains to run on time was a real accomplishment. And you don't know what someone's going to take away. And what they do take away is their takeaway. You can't tell them they're wrong for doing that.
Right there behind the,
So earlier, you talked about stark contrast with the you also talked about how train really look at things just diversion when we accomplish objectives without caring about the story. I really don't think it's something that originates in games itself. You don't exist in a vacuum. You're being informed by what you purchase and what you demand. We demonstrated how we feel about things subconsciously through the games we ask them. And there's times where we don't want a story, we want to be distracted. And the reason why we're playing chess, again, because we don't know why. these two sides of the fight, they want to keep recreating the battle.
Yeah. No, I think it speaks just exactly what you said before, and it mixes a little bit with the financial realities, right? You tell us as a room of game players,
And then
people are,
other art as well.
Yeah.
Most paintings, books, movies, they're what the culture wants to see and how it feels, not something that an artist wants to inform culture.
yeah, there's business-driven art or craft, and then there's, personal-driven art. And I would say that Trains game was not making as much money.
Given that there's one copy that's never been sold, I probably.
It belongs in a museum.
So we created an interactive forum in games, and the people who are interested in money are going to look at a room like this and go, what kind of games does this room want to play? What are they playing now? And none of them's going to say Trains. Yes, and you're going to pay us, and we're going to look at how you vote with your money.
And that's,
But artists, as the tools get pushed down, it'll be easier and easier for real artists to just do real art for art's sake and try to make the point.
and that's sort of the thing, is sometimes I feel bad for Call of Duty because it's become such a whipping boy in our circle, and then I think about how much money it makes, and I stop feeling bad.
So, I mean, there's a number of different things in this one. As far as Call of Duty, at some point we should talk about Modern Warfare 1, because I actually think we don't see it now, but there were a lot of things we were working on that were actually super fun. Like, do you guys remember the AC-130 scene in the first Modern Warfare? That was to talk about the remote cars of modern war, right? Those guys couldn't hurt you. There was nothing they could do to you. And here you were wiping them out while this guy was like, one more for the kill reel.
Yeah.
So there was actually a lot that we were trying to discuss there, but a lot of that gets lost in the way that we, as a culture, digested that work, even as a game creation culture, because it kind of hurts me all the time. I feel like all the wrong lessons as a designer are taken from Call of Duty. I mean, even on just pure design front, do you guys remember the training level at the very beginning to help you choose your difficulty? It's one of my favorite things about it. That wasn't picked up by anybody, right? It was just, hey, you can skinner box the multiplayer, sweet. But as far as money goes, money is a huge motivator for this. I completely agree. I am not convinced, given the economics I've seen in the games industry right now, that we, as a consuming public, actually want about it. I mean, there's a reason that Minecraft was bought for $2 billion, right? There's a reason that we see so many of these studios go under and have layoffs. I think that you're right, and I think there's nothing wrong with gameplay for gameplay's sake. It's just like I would say, I would never ask you to get rid of blockbuster movies. I like blockbuster action summer movies as much as the next person. It's just that they can't be all we produce. And right now, they're like an overwhelming majority of the AAA space. Right.
So this has to do more, I guess, with toxicity inherent in certain aspects of the culture. A lot also, as far as looking at the mechanics having to do with multiplayer play, the effects of anonymity on that, and how this culture, both video games, multiplayer mechanics, and anonymity, kind of came together to create something that has been talked to death over the past year, the whole Gamergate scandal and all of that. How we can avoid moving in that direction,
So a couple things real quick. There's a whole Gamergate panel, so we're not going to touch specifically on that. But something we mentioned in, I think it's in the next block, I think. Yeah. But I will say what we said the last panel is also true. What you're kind of hearing is the death stream of people losing their power. So this used to be my thing. I used to be better at it than you. Now you're better than me. I'm at home with a headset on. I'm going to stream whatever I want to stream. It will end. The industry, the larger industry, bears some serious responsibilities to look inward as to how they allow people to communicate. Freeform streaming of things over headsets that isn't moderated would not be allowed in almost anything you do at any age until people do it when their parents don't look.
And also how we incentivize people to behave better.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I think it is on us in some ways to create systems within our games that not only punish bad behavior, but also encourage positive behavior. And I mean, it was really until the modern period that we saw laws as to improve the morality of society rather than simply as punitive. And we need to start looking at that way in games. I think inherent in the design creates the culture of these games.
And I think it's important too that, you know, the sort of prevailing thought to this point has been that, oh, they're just kids and they'll grow out of this. And that's the dumbest way to approach this because we don't know that and they're not.
As a major corporation, right? That is the easiest line. Yep.
And we have to also recognize that social acceptance is not a click away. It takes a long over time. You know, 20 years ago, if you were born gay or lesbian, imagine how difficult life would have been compared to today. It's the same phenomenon. It takes a long time for social structure to change. It's just not a one single day or a month. It's years, it's generations of things. You know, 50 years ago, I would not be standing here, sitting here and talking to you guys from this panel group. It would be a completely different scenario for me to do this. It's the same phenomenon. Today I have the same equal voice to what I do and how I present it. The representation of that took a long time to do. Even in context to America, think about it from the world. It is the same phenomenon that's happening in the world. Race, segregation, all different kind of set that we talked about in games throughout this last year. It's happening still today. Slavery still exists in other parts of the world that people have to go through. There's a sex slavery that actually happening in America today that actually does affect us in several ways and the rest of the population. It is an evolving situation. And I think that's where games comes in place. It can change the world in a certain way. And I'm going to go back to Luke's comments in terms of, and defer my own, in terms of why games can change. We can start to think about these. Think about, make people motivated about why these things are important. Why is humanity is one and what is it important to us? What are the people are doing? We start to see, when we see games, I think most of the time we see as a one single entity. We see as a one single country. Sometimes we forget about this planet, and then that's the bigger equation of games, where games can start to make us think about one planet, one world, one living thing, and that is the bigger part of this panel, I think.
I'm going to use your term. What's your term? Design creates culture?
Yes.
Yes, great term. I'm stealing it. And yeah. So what's frustrating me about this topic is it is so easy, in my mind, on the game design side, to fix this. Right? You can really encourage good behavior, and it's not that hard. Even on the tabletop, I worked on a game where it was based in a fantasy version of Japan, and you had to bow to your opponent before you started. That was it. Little tiny thing. It made you respect the person across the table. It would take so little to fix this situation. It's so frustrating from the outside to not see it done. Yes, back there.
Do you think that that's because artists have gotten away from the art and tagging on to what he was saying? They're more obsessed with the money aspect of it. It's more like, okay, I'm broke. I've been living in my car, I gotta make this dollar, I don't wanna eat McDonald's anymore, and I'm making this money, and it doesn't really matter what the product is that I put out. I don't have to put as much thought into it, because I can just do what they tell me to do, and put out what's going to sell, as opposed to putting out something that's going to be quality, and going to be life-altering for someone.
Well, art has always been commercial. Always, always, always. Go to the Vatican, look at all the pretty paintings of God and Jesus, and realize that they were paid for. But you're right to commission. Yes, there we go. Patrons, the patron system, because that sounds a lot better. But there definitely is an aspect to that, I think, where at a certain point you can. An irresponsible artist can sort of shut half of themselves down and be like, it's a paycheck. So you're not wrong about that, but it's not, this is not a new problem.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, we have about 3 minutes left. So any more questions out there?
Let's go.
Oh, way in the back.
So,
Be loud.
what's that?
Be loud.
All right. So I don't want to go too far back, but one of the questions I had when you were talking about like people's interpretation of different content, with games like Hatred coming out, where do you find like where's the line drawn? And if games like Hatred have a place in the market, do you feel like they need to have some kind of? Do you think there should be some kind of ethical requirement with certain games?
Two things. So I will absolutely defend their right to make hatred and say they shouldn't make hatred. I think that game is terrible, is going to be terrible, is a piece of schlock which is going to sell on being a piece of schlock. I will also very much defend Steam's right. I think Steam was right in the first place. They're a private business. They can do whatever they want. They don't have to sell it on their service. And so I think that as an industry, we can internally film and these things get created. I think people should be able to create them. I don't think we have to give everything a megaphone. That's where it comes down to.
I'm going to quote an anonymous gentleman from the internet on this, which is to say, I may not agree with your opinion, but I will defend to the death your right to shut up.
I hear time for one more. Anybody? All right, right there. Right here.
A few years ago, at one of the games as art panel, there was a sociologist, or excuse me, anthropologist who spoke and said one of the things that makes studying games as art difficult is because anthropologically games are seen as a culture piece, not an art piece. And it falls more into the realm of culture and sociology and that when it's classified and not in the realm of arts and classical literature. And so when you were talking about teaching these classes and so forth, I'm wondering about if it's something that you need to try and pull away from the anthropologists and sociologists to get it into the media side of the world.
You know, in our earlier panel, we were talking about, what do you call them, D-games there?
H.
H-games, yes, I got my letter wrong there. All right, so this panel was on, is it okay to like terrible things, right? I think that game, those games can teach you about a culture. When I played a terrible game when I was young, I mentioned the last thing too, about the Mongols. And it was terrible. The things you had to do in that game were terrible. But it taught me what you had to do to be a Mongol. And I helped I learned something in the process. So I think there is we do reflect ourselves in our gaming manuals. If you look at the Americans now, a lot of people will say, man, all Americans play first-person shooters. And America keeps going to war. Someone's going to make that comparison. It's going to be very hard to say that those were just culture, unless they reflect it.
And just to speak about the academic environment, the problem is when you start talking cross-curricular stuff, departments hate each other and fight. Has anyone in here had to deal with that? Yeah, it's a nightmare, right? So if anthropology has something, or if the arts has something and anthropology wants it, the arts won't give it to them, even if they're not using it. Because it's a point of pride. It's a pissing contest. You can't have it. And that's where, as humans, we defeat ourselves.
All future classes will be online. There will be. The world beats. The world beats. Yes. All right, I think we're done. Let's go.
But while we have to clear out of this room, if you guys want to keep asking questions, I think this discussion is important. I'm happy to be right outside. What about you guys? For at least for a few minutes.